Boys and girls, it gives me great pleasure to be with you all here in Vadodara this morning at the start of NIMUN 14. It's a great privilege and I am very grateful for that very warm introduction, which was flattering but left out one key piece of information, which is that I was India's representative to the first committee of the United Nations in New York from 1992 to 1995. And in fact, just to add to that, when I went to New York in the summer of 1992, we were still a non-permanent member. I caught that at the fag end of our 2-year term. And I was in fact the political officer for the term, remaining term that we had in the UN Security Council. And so I can tell you with firm conviction that what I heard this morning, in fact, gives me great hope. The impassioned, enthusiastic manner in which the children put across their views for a better world, in fact, gives me great hope, gives me great feeling of confidence that we will achieve that India, that world that we seek tomorrow. So my congratulations to all. Allow me also to extend a warm welcome as an Indian to our French guests. Je souhaite la bienvenue chaleureuse à nos amis de France. I want to begin by simply telling you how my journey began. It's very tempting to speak a little bit about my time as a student when I see so many young faces before me. I came to this city as a 16-and-a-half-year-old, having completed my senior Cambridge from a boarding school called the Rajkumar College in Rajkot. And I made Baroda, now Vadodara, my home for the next 3 years. And it was an extremely exciting time of my life. I joined the Maharaja Sayajirao University, and contrary to society's expectations, I actually joined the Faculty of Arts. And I wanted to read literature, I wanted to study archaeology. I went and joined a 2-year diploma course at the Max Muller Bhavan and studied German. By the way, I never got to use my German in my professional career, which was largely concentrated on East Asia, China, Japan. And the first time I actually visited Germany was last year. But having learned the language helps a great deal. And I went to Berlin last year as the chair of the Think 20 engagement group appointed by the Prime Minister for India's G20 presidency. And I had a chance to meet Chancellor Scholz in a hall full of Germans. And I began by saying that in German, that das ist mein erster Besuch nach Deutschland und ich freue mich sehr, hier zu sein. I said, this is my first visit to Germany and it gives me great pleasure to be here, and you have no idea how that worked like a charm on the local people. The importance of speaking a common language. The way you put it, of course, is much better, to speak the language of humanity. I spent 3 years here, and I was still 19-and-a-half when I graduated. I always wanted to join the Foreign Service. I had made up my mind when I was 6, exactly 6 years old. I had no clue what the Foreign Service was, but I did know that I didn't want to join the IAS, I didn't want the police service, and that I wanted the Foreign Service. I loved languages, I loved meeting people, I wanted to know more about the outside world. And I still had to wait for 1.5 years till I was 21 before I could write the civil services exam. And right I did after waiting for another 2 years, having done an MBA in Ahmedabad, and I got in on my first attempt. And last month I began my 44th year in government service. The first 37 and a half years in the foreign service, and the last 6 years as the head of India's largest defense and security think tank. Now, you know, I feel that this is extraordinary that you should have NIMUN and the mock model UN program here in Vadodara, but it's not surprising because increasingly the world of tomorrow brings about a great convergence between what happens within a country and what happens on the international stage. And so that growing confluence of geopolitics and geoeconomics, both at the national and international levels, is going to be part of the world that you will inherit tomorrow. And so it is extremely apposite and appropriate that you should be familiar with that world of tomorrow as you seek not only to be bystanders and observers, but also to be active participants and to seek to shape that world. You will be the generation that will from now on take India to greater heights of glory, to achieve Viksit Bharat, that is a developed India by 2047, and to also ensure that it is Surakshit Bharat. For there cannot be economic development without security, and there cannot be true security in all its dimensions without inclusive economic growth and development. As you all know, and as many of you just suggested, we today live in a world in great flux. And this is a world that we have inherited. It's a legacy world, a global order that was bequeathed to us as a result of the tumultuous and horrendous developments of the two great wars, in which millions died, millions were incapacitated and devastated, and the world had been brought onto its knees. It's not as if the world never aspired to have peace and progress. In fact, after the First Great War, a feeble attempt was made at the Treaty of Versailles in 1919, but it failed to satisfy either the victors or the vanquished. It failed to satisfy Germany, which had been defeated in the First World War. It also failed to satisfy Japan, which had fought that First World War on the side of the Allies. And two of these great powers militarized, and the failure of the Treaty of Versailles was followed by another feeble attempt at creating the League of Nations. The objective was then, as now, to ensure that we create a world, a framework which is capable of preserving peace and providing opportunities for progress, development, protection of human rights, and a certain basic equality of humanity. But the world's biggest economy at that time, not quite yet the biggest military power, that is the United States of America under President Wilson, did not support the League of Nations. And the League of Nations, by the way, wasn't a bad idea. It didn't have a privileged veto. It professed to set up a flatter organization, but without the support of major powers, it was doomed to failure, and it did fail, finally sinking without a trace, without any lament, in 1946, a full 1 year after the United Nations as we know it was set up in 1945. But that world, which still exists 79 years later, is today dysfunctional. It has not been able to effectively discharge its duties and responsibilities, and notably in this we must indict the UN Security Council, For even during the Cold War, when there were bloc politics, the two blocs were quite capable of devising a modus vivendi between themselves, despite the use of vetoes, a prolific use of vetoes, to stall progress on a number of issues that they did not agree with, including, by the way, for Western powers, stalling progress with regard to that abhorrent practice of apartheid in South Africa, or resolution, for example, of the imbroglio and this big war and questions surrounding the future of Palestine. Despite all that, they were capable of having some kind of an equilibrium among themselves. But today, nearly 8 decades later, we find that in this era of drifting multipolarity, growing strategic autonomy, a growing sense of nationalism, a certain degree of insular behavior in terms of protecting your markets against the order of the liberal trading order, we find that the UN Security Council is today truly dysfunctional. But does that mean that we condemn it and throw it out? It is important not to throw the baby out with the bathwater. The framework is well intended, it has always been well intended, but it has its infirmities, which also includes, for example, the unequal structure that it represents. For this UN Security Council structure, with a privileged 5 members with veto power, has never seen any genuine reform. And that is something that is imminent, urgent and pressing. The only time that the United Nations genuinely lent itself to any kind of reform was after 4 years of debate, from 1961 to 1965 in the ECOSOC, and finally in 1965 the non-permanent category was expanded from 6 to 10, bringing the total membership up from 11 to 15. And that was the last time the UN Security Council allowed itself to be reformed. For it's not easy to demand reform or change in the existing global order. Despite its imperfections, it requires all the 5 permanent members and a great majority of the UN membership to agree to any changes that you make to the United Nations Charter. And my firm belief, sometimes pessimistic, is that global orders are neither created nor dismantled easily. No countries give up their privileged powers voluntarily or easily. In fact, the only change that we have seen so far has been through great and cataclysmic wars, through bloodshed, through the trumpets and drums and banners of global wars, and through that tumultuous change from the ashes of the great wars, we have seen the United Nations emerge. But that begs the question, do we have to wait for another war of that magnitude in order to bring about change? Good sense would suggest, and I hope there is good sense out there, that we should not wait for another war. Friends, we are today in an era in which the global order is in flux. There is a great deal of uncertainty out there as to the future. And we have seen that much of this is attributable to major power contestation. We have seen how the COVID-19 pandemic devastated economies around the world. It also acted as, unfortunately, as an accelerant for existing differences between various countries. The world essentially has always been challenged by a number of factors, and I've tried to summarize them for you as the 7 T's, the T factors, not T-Rex, but they almost act as, dangerously as having a T-Rex in the room. The first T is that of trade. As you've seen that trade today is increasingly dividing a globalized world. The globalized world, by the way, is here to stay. Globalization as a process, notwithstanding the tide of protectionism, nationalism, and a certain insular way of thinking, is a genie that cannot be put back into the bottle. So globalization is here to stay. The question is, what kind of globalization do you want it for tomorrow? Do we want it as a globalization that is gained by certain countries, or as a process that allows everyone equal opportunity? And so trade is something that is capable of playing a positive role in globalization, provided we open up our markets to each other, we do not game the system. It's hard to block trade also. Trade is fungible. Trade is not conducted from the war rooms of ministries of defense, but from the boardrooms of private industry. And that is why we have seen that even in a challenged world, trade has grown even among partners that do not see eye to eye one with the other. Major powers that are engaged in contestation, like the United States and China, or China and Japan, or China and Australia, China and India, have seen their trade grow, even as there are geopolitical and geostrategic differences. The second T is that of technology, which is also being weaponized today, but with much greater success. Because technology is not easy to acquire. Cutting edge technology requires a great deal of funding, and such funding usually comes from either governments or big tech. And there is also the issue of IP and proprietorship. And therefore, in the field of technology, there is much greater sway that governments and big tech have today. And we are seeing it play out today in a manner in which, for example, the West, particularly the United States of America, has used sanctions, export controls, and such other restrictions to ensure that high-tech items are not flowing to an adversary like China. And that is something that also divides the world today. The third T is that of territory and territorial differences. These abound no matter which geography you are talking about. And you take a look at other accelerants today, like the war in Ukraine or the war in Gaza, or you see the differences in the Indo-Pacific between India and China, or China and Southeast Asia in the South China Sea, or China and Japan in the East China Sea. Geography and territory matters. It's at the heart of most disputes, because national identity comes from geography and maps and borders, and therefore it is always going to remain one of the potent forces as a vector in this unfolding globalization as we see it today. Terrorism, which is the fourth T, is supposed to unite the world. Today, the whole world is suffering from international terrorism. It's no longer a problem that is to be identified with India and Pakistan alone. It's not just India's problem. We have seen that whether it is India, whether it is France, whether it is the United States, all countries are under grave threat of international terrorism. And yet terrorism fails to unite the world. In fact, the United Nations has long grappled with the possibility of finalizing an international global convention on terrorism. And India has been pushing for it in the 6th Committee for a very long time. I served in the 6th Committee also for a short while. And I can tell you that there is no agreement today, because there are countries that place their personal interests before the interests of society. And we therefore see that under the 1267 Al-Qaeda and Sanctions Committee at the UN, it's very difficult for countries like the US, UK, France, India, to even propose the listing of LET and JEM terrorists as global terrorists, to be proscribed and to be sanctioned, because it only takes one permanent member like China to use technical holds to thwart the entire process, as we have seen, because they treat Pakistan as a strategic asset and cannot see it come under pressure. The next T is that of tenets. The world today is divided on things like values, narratives, systems of political, social, economic and cultural governance, with the liberal, open, democratic countries pitted against authoritarian unitary states, single party states, often Marxist and communist. And in this we see a jousting for the establishing of principles of superiority, with one side claiming that their narratives, their systems of governance are superior to the other. And this is dividing the world today. But this division today is also leading to the next T, which is complete lack of transparency, the sixth T. You see, it's very important to understand the world around us in terms of, for example, security threats, defense threats. It's possible to engage in bean counting with regard to assets, with regard to the number of tanks, ships, planes, that a country possesses. But it's virtually impossible to ascertain motivations and intentions without a proper dialogue. And the loss of that dialogue today, the inability of major powers to engage in any kind of meaningful dialogue, has created a certain lack of transparency. There is a transparency deficit today, which ultimately leads to the last T, which is a deficit of trust. So we are living in a world today in which there are disruptions caused in supply chains, there is debt distress, there is economic slowdown around the world. And it's not just the COVID-19 pandemic that put these pressures on the global community. The wars in Ukraine and Gaza have further complicated, exacerbated these issues. And it is in this context that we see that global supply chains, critical supply chains, are especially under duress. And there are at least 75 countries of the global south that are reeling under the challenges of all these factors put together, which have caused shortages of food, fuel, fertilizer, and more importantly, finance. And that is something that we have to take into account as India looks at its regional and global environment. We see that we live in a difficult neighborhood. We have unresolved boundary disputes with two neighbors, one to the north, one to the west. Terrorism has as its fountainhead Pakistan in our neighborhood. The return of the Taliban in Afghanistan has also raised several questions about, for example, achieving SDGs in a country that needs them most, Afghanistan. As to what is the future with regard to the women there, with regard to gender equality, with regard to education for the girl child. Will all the achievements of the last 20 years be in vain? Will they fall by the wayside now that the Taliban are back in power? We have also seen how our region is beset with other problems like drugs smuggling, weapons and arms smuggling, human trafficking. We have seen how, especially off the Horn of Africa, the piracy has once again reared its opportunistic head, taking advantage of the disruptions caused by the Houthis plunging into the Middle East cauldron and attacking shipping in the Red Sea. And so these are issues that we have to deal with even as we move further up on the global international stage. Taken together, I think these uncertainties today are numerous, but they are compounded by the advent of technology, especially the cyber threats that are emerging, the threats that have emerged in the digital space. We have seen how artificial intelligence especially is going to change the wars of tomorrow. It will bring about hybrid wars of the type that we have never imagined, where we may have lethal autonomous weapon systems directing wars in which the temperament and character of generals will no longer matter. It will no longer matter that people, even in war, show chivalry and compassion. For the AI-driven weapons of tomorrow will have none of that compassion. They will have much greater accuracy, much smaller, errors in terms of targeting, and they will be completely bereft of all human emotions. And so the task of pursuing a humane world will become even more challenging in the era of not just standoff weapons, beyond visual range weapons, but also especially the era of artificial intelligence, on which the governments of the world and big tech have yet to agree as to what will be the guiding principles. For me, one of the most insidious aspects of globalization today, in this era of flux and uncertainty, is the emergence of a certain kind of civil society that transcends borders, that transcends the colors of passports, that transcends national identity. This can be a great force for humanity as well, if we are able to combine across borders to address the bigger challenges of climate change, for example. But it can be extremely corrosive, harmful, insidious if such civil society groups and NGOs work at complete cross purposes with the elected governments of the day around the world. This can and is creating a certain degree of disarray in the international scenario today. Influence operations are rampant. In this age of influence operation, propaganda is rampant. And I think civil society and educational and research institutions and young minds such as yours need to be wary of the subtle changes that are being brought about. And especially, it behoves you as young and brilliant minds that will guide me to the grassroots of all problems, to be open-minded, to be able to accept the point of view preferred by others without allowing some kind of ideological corrosion to prevent you from doing that. And that is why we have also been emphasizing the need, as the Prime Minister of India has often, Mr. Narendra Modi has emphasized the need for dialogue to resolve all outstanding disputes. Differences should be resolved not on the battlefield, as he has said on numerous occasions. I believe that the need of the hour is not only to improve the UN framework and all its attendant organizations, as I said before, simply because it is imperfect, simply because it is more dysfunctional today than before, does not mean that we reject it. It is the only framework that we have, so we must value it. And the great difference between India and some of the others that challenge this inequality in the UN is that India does not seek to reject the UN framework. India does not reject the existing global order. All India is seeking is a level playing field, a seat for itself also to sit at the high table and to be part of that agenda setting and decision making in the existing global framework. We are not revanchist, we are not autarkic, we are not looking for some kind of going back to the drawing board as far as the UN is concerned, but we want to improve it, and we want to make sure that India has a voice at that table. India, as you all know, is eminently qualified to be a member of the UN Security Council, a permanent member, and I must say that we are grateful to France for, like many others, for having supported India's permanent membership of the UN. And I must tell you that France is truly a great strategic partner for India. It's a partner that has always shown an independent streak. It has never allowed itself to be led by the nose by any other great power, and we value that, as we did in the immediate aftermath of our nuclear tests in 1998. France was one of the very few countries that had kept up a strategic dialogue with us, even as others had attempted to initially put pressure on India. France today is involved in India's search for better technologies to ensure that we not only have a Viksit Bharat but also a Surakshit and safe and secure Bharat. For tomorrow we will need weapons platforms of the type that can deter adversaries. We don't seek to dominate, we do seek to deter. And we require that deterrence in which technology is involved, the kind of technology that France too is willing to give India, including in the manufacturing of high performance fighter aircraft and helicopter engines. Safran, as you know, is a very big company in France, and India is looking at Safran as well as one of the providers. So let me mention here that apart from the UN Security Council, there is a vital need, as you already mentioned, to reform the multilateral development banks and the international financial institutions. For these are also reflections of that bygone era in which a certain Bretton Woods structure was created to reflect the equilibrium and balance of power of that era, and they are completely out of sync with regard to the shifting balance of power. For in the last 8 decades the world has not remained frozen. There are processes that have led to a shift in economic power, a shift in military power to our part of the world, and all that new growth is not necessarily coming out of China alone. There is a much wider theatre in which the impulses of growth and development are manifesting themselves, and one of those great regions is India itself. And beyond India, all the way up to the east coast of Africa, we see that new impulse, and that is why we use the term Indo-Pacific today and not that arcane, outdated term called the Asia-Pacific. Of course, the Asia-Pacific was a very relevant concept for its time. It lasted a full half century. From 1945 onwards till the end of the last century, Asia-Pacific was in fact what defined the changing balance of power, the shift of global engines of economic growth and development to Asia, but to a particular part of Asia, to a niche corner in East Asia. We saw first the rise of Japan from the ashes, phoenix-like from the ashes of the Second World War. It rose once again to become a dominant economy by becoming a manufacturing center for the rest of the world, and it sold its wares and products across that great ocean, the Pacific Ocean, to the world's greatest market, and that is the United States of America. And thence came the genesis of this term Asia Pacific, and Japan was followed by the Asian tigers like Korea, Taiwan, Singapore, Hong Kong, and then from the beginning of the 1970s, late 70s, you also saw China accessing that same route to consolidate this whole concept of Asia Pacific. But as I said, today this is not limited to that part of the world. This growth and development is no longer a monopoly of East Asia. It has spread to Southeast Asia, South Asia, all the way across the Western Indian Ocean to Africa. And therefore to deny the Indo-Pacific, as some countries are wont to do, is to actually be less than inclusive, to be seeking privileged status for themselves. It also tantamounts to countries rejecting greater democracy, greater transparency. For the Indo-Pacific represents a much larger geography. It is inclusive, it is more democratic, it is more in tune with the emerging ambitions and aspirations of a much wider swathe of geography and many more people around the world. And therefore, the Indo-Pacific and all its attendant dialogue mechanisms is here to stay. The failure of the MDBs and the IFIs will continue to create problems for the future. It is therefore urgent that the World Bank and the IMF in particular look at how they wish to enhance their financing per se, to ensure that they move in for hybrid financing as well, to bring in the private sector, to urge governments to cough up more money, to also change the voting share to represent the realities of today. For we cannot live in a structure and function effectively if the large emerging economies such as India, for example, which is growing at a very fast clip, the fastest among all large economies in the world, still has a vote share that is not reflecting its contribution as a GDP to the global GDP. So these are profound changes today that are taking place. India is at the forefront of these profound changes. We have successfully ensured that we retain our strategic autonomy. We have successfully demonstrated that seeking a multipolar world does not mean that we cannot cooperate with others. In fact, India has demonstrated the ability to work for a multipolar world while engaging in multi-alignment as well, especially issue-based alignment with other countries. We have also ensured that through the G20 process that we can demonstrate to the world how such an organization such as the G20 can be made even more inclusive and more responsive to the emerging needs and challenges today. At a time when the UN Security Council has failed to deliver on key attributes and processes, it is the G20, which is a much flatter organization, which is required to keep the politics outside the room and focus on economic growth and development, on post-COVID recovery, on debt distress, on how we might share digital public infrastructure with the rest of the world, a field in which India epitomizes success for a large and populous country. We have a model that can be shared with developed and developing countries alike. The G20 is one in which India has succeeded in bringing in the African Union as well. And the EU is already there. So if there is one organization left today which gives us hope, it is the G20, provided that we keep the politics outside the room and focus on the economics. And so I think India has done well to highlight the importance of the G20 during its presidency. I played my part as the Think 20 chair. That was the most important, the largest engagement group. And we organized about 65 events in India and around the world. We continue to hope that the other presidencies will take that task forward of particularly looking at the needs of developing countries. So I think I should end my remarks here and leave you to ponder over the challenges of tomorrow. I believe that the kind of structure that you've been provided here will in fact enable you to say that you are also convening the summit of the future on your own. It's not just the United Nations that will have a pact for the future, or a summit for the future. And in a sense, I would say that this summit of the future is far more important than what the leaders, the global leaders, held not too long ago. And the kind of lessons that you learn and the kind of inferences that you draw from your dialogue will actually be considered the pact of the future, pact for the future. So I wish you good luck and success in all your endeavors, and once again my personal gratitude to the Navrachana school and its authorities for inviting me, for giving me a chance to come back to Vadodara after a full half century when I first came, and 35 years after my last visit. And may God bless you all.
Thank you so much, sir. What a wonderful address. Thank you. Yes.
Thank you.
I think everybody's standing.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Deeply appreciate it.
Thank you. Thank you so much, sir.
Thank you, Ambassador Chinoy, for your inspiring words. Your insights have undoubtedly set the stage for the meaningful discussions that will take place over the next 2 days.